The Boeing 777 cruised at 39,000 feet through the darkness above the Atlantic, its cabin lights dimmed for the red-eye flight from Frankfurt to Washington. In Seat 11C, Major Kaida Ghost, Nakamura, slept with her head against the window, her short black hair falling across a face marked by the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying secrets too heavy for dreams. The thin scar running from her left temple to her jawline caught the faint glow of the reading light above, a reminder of a mission that officially never happened. The flight attendant had noticed her earlier, the way she'd politely declined alcohol, how her eyes had swept the cabin with the practiced assessment of someone trained to spot threats. Military, definitely. But the woman in 11C wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a simple gray sweater, and worn leather boots that had seen more than airport terminals. 3 rows back, Navy SEAL Captain Marcus Reaper Torres couldn't sleep. The 42-year-old veteran kept checking his watch, knowing that somewhere over the ocean below, Operation Nightfall was either succeeding spectacularly or failing catastrophically. His team was pinned down in a compound outside Kandahar, waiting for air support that might never come. The secure satellite phone in his carry-on had been silent for 6 hours, never a good sign in his line of work. The turbulence hit without warning. The aircraft shuddered violently, throwing passengers against their seatbelts. Emergency lighting flickered on as the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." What the captain didn't announce was the classified message that had just come through on the aircraft's military communication channel. A message that would transform this routine commercial flight into something else entirely. The woman in 11C stirred, her pilot's instincts detecting the subtle changes in engine pitch and airframe stress that civilian passengers would never notice. Captain Torres unbuckled his seatbelt and moved forward, his trained eye scanning faces in the dim cabin. He needed someone with very specific skills, and he needed them now. The mission parameters had changed mid-flight, and conventional solutions were no longer an option. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm Captain Torres, United States Navy. I need to know, are there any combat pilots aboard this aircraft?" The cabin fell silent except for the steady thrum of engines. Passengers exchanged nervous glances. A businessman in first class nervously adjusted his tie. A college student pulled out her phone to record what she assumed was some kind of elaborate prank. But in Seat 11C, Major Kaida Nakamura opened her eyes. The ghost was about to wake up. The scar on her face seemed to pulse with memory as she turned toward the SEAL captain, her dark eyes reflecting something that made him take an involuntary step backward. This wasn't the face of someone who flew cargo planes or training missions. This was the face of someone who had stared death in the eye at Mach 2 and smiled back. "That depends," she said quietly, her voice carrying the hint of an accent that spoke of childhood summers in Okinawa and teenage years in Texas. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Captain Torres felt the first stirring of hope he'd experienced in hours. The woman's posture, the way she'd assessed him in a single glance, the controlled tension in her voice, all of it screamed fighter pilot. But there was something else, something in her eyes that suggested she'd been places and done things that even his security clearance couldn't access. "I'm asking," he said, lowering his voice so only she could hear, "if you've ever flown combat missions in a restricted theater. Off the books. The kind where if you don't come back, there's no flag on your coffin and no notification to next of kin." Around them, the airplane continued its subtle but concerning vibrations. Other passengers were beginning to notice the extended nature of their technical difficulties. Flight attendants moved with practiced calm, but their smiles were becoming strained. The pilot's voice hadn't returned to the intercom, and that silence was starting to feel ominous. Kaida studied the SEAL captain for a long moment, nodding the calluses on his hands, The way he unconsciously favored his left leg, probably shrapnel, judging by the specific cant of his stance. His eyes held the particular brand of desperation that came from having teammates in mortal danger with limited options for extraction. "Ghost," she said simply, offering her call sign instead of her name. It was both an answer and a warning. Torres felt his pulse quicken. Every pilot had heard whispers of Ghost, the Air Force major who'd single-handedly turned the tide of 3 separate black operations, who'd flown missions so classified that they existed only in the private conversations of generals and the nightmares of enemy combatants. Most believed she was either a legend or dead. Apparently, she was neither. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, "you're actually her." Ghost's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them. "You have 90 seconds to tell me what you need before I go back to sleep and pretend this conversation never happened." The airplane shuddered again, more violently this time, and several passengers gasped. The captain's announcement finally came. "Folks, we're going to need to make an emergency landing. Flight crews, prepare for immediate descent." But Torres wasn't looking at the ceiling speakers. He was looking at Ghost, who had tilted her head slightly, a predator's gesture that suggested she was hearing something the rest of them couldn't. Her fingers drummed once against the armrest, a nervous habit left over from years of flying stick-and-rudder aircraft where split-second decisions meant the difference between mission success and a smoking crater. "This isn't a mechanical failure," she said, so quietly that only Torres could hear. "And this isn't a coincidence." The SEAL captain's blood ran cold as the implications hit him. Somehow, someway, Operation Nightfall had just followed him onto a civilian aircraft at 39,000 feet. The hunter had become the hunted, and everyone aboard this plane had just become either an asset or a liability in a game whose rules were written in blood and classified ink. Ghost was already reaching for the emergency equipment briefing card in the seat pocket, but Torres could see she wasn't reading about oxygen masks and life vests. She was studying the aircraft schematic with the focused intensity of someone planning an impossible solution to an unsolvable problem. "Tell me about your teammates," she said, "and then tell me exactly what kind of aircraft support they need." The woman who'd been sleeping in 11C was gone. In her place sat someone who looked like she could fly anything with wings through anything with teeth. The legend was about to become operational again, whether she wanted to or not. Captain Torres began to speak, his voice low and urgent, as outside the cabin windows the lights of the European coastline began to disappear beneath a blanket of storm clouds that seemed to be moving in patterns too precise to be entirely natural. The emergency descent continued, but both Torres and Ghost knew they weren't heading for any airport listed on civilian flight charts. This was something else entirely, a diversion that would either save lives or end them, depending on what happened in the next few minutes. Ghost closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, Torres saw something that made him understand why enemies spoke her call sign in whispers. She wasn't just a pilot. She was a weapon that had been sleeping, and now she was very much awake. "All right, Captain," she said, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had made peace with impossible odds long ago. "Let's go save your boys." The Boeing 777 continued its descent through the darkness, carrying 312 passengers who thought they were on their way to Washington, and 2 people who knew they were about to enter a war zone that wasn't supposed to exist. Outside, lightning began to flash in patterns that radar operators would later swear looked almost like Morse code. The Ghost was hunting again. Torres pulled out his secure satellite phone and began entering coordinates with the steady hands of someone who had done this too many times before. The screen displayed a map of the North Atlantic, but the blinking red dot wasn't showing their current position. It was showing where they needed to be in 47 minutes if his team was going to see sunrise. "The compound is here," he said, showing Ghost the display. My boys have been pinned down for 6 hours. They were supposed to have Apache support, but the birds got redirected to another theater. No fixed wing available in the area, and the weather's making drone operations impossible. Ghost studied the tactical display with the kind of focus that made Tors understand why she'd earned her legendary status. Her fingers traced elevation lines and approach vectors with the unconscious precision of someone who thought in 3 dimensions and spoke fluent violence. "Distance from target to nearest friendly airstrip," she asked. "140 nautical miles, but that's not the problem." Tors hesitated. "The problem is what's between here and there." He switched the display to show a wider tactical overview. Red symbols dotted the map like a rash: surface-to-air missile sites, radar installations, and aircraft patrol routes that formed an interlocking network of death for anything that tried to fly through unauthorized. "They've got S-400s here, and here," Tors continued, pointing to the missile positions. "Plus roving fighter patrols and enough radar coverage to track a Sparrow. Anything flying through that airspace without proper clearance codes gets turned into scrap metal and regret." Ghost nodded slowly. "What about your boys' immediate situation?" "Surrounded, ammunition running low. They've got wounded, including our medic." Tor's jaw tightened. "And the opposition knows exactly where they are. It's only a matter of time before they bring in heavy weapons." The airplane lurched suddenly, and the pilot's voice returned to the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to weather conditions, we're being diverted to an alternate airport. We should be on the ground shortly." Ghost and Tors exchanged glances. Neither believed the weather story. "Captain," Ghost said quietly, "I need you to understand something. What you're asking me to do, what I think you're asking me to do, it's not possible with conventional aircraft. The mission profile you're describing would require something with capabilities that don't officially exist." Tors leaned closer. "What if I told you that this diversion isn't coincidence? What if I told you that someone with a very high security clearance has been tracking this situation and arranged for us to be in the same place at the same time?" Ghost's expression didn't change, but her fingers stopped drumming against the armrest. "I'd say that someone has been reading files they shouldn't have access to. And I'd say that someone believes you're the only pilot alive who can fly the kind of mission that saves my team." Outside the cabin windows, city lights were becoming visible through the cloud cover. But these weren't the lights of any major airport. The pattern was too sparse, too military. As the aircraft banked into its final approach, Ghost could see runway lights configured in a layout she recognized from a dozen classified installations around the world. "Where exactly are we landing, Captain?" Tors checked his secure phone again. "RAF Fairford, officially for weather diversion and technical inspection." "And unofficially?" "Officially, I don't know what you're talking about." Ghost smiled for the first time since the conversation began, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Captain Tors, I think someone has been very carefully orchestrating tonight's events. The question is whether they've been orchestrating them to save your teammates or to put me back in a cockpit I swore I'd never sit in again." The landing gear deployed with a hydraulic whine that resonated through the cabin. Passengers around them were gathering their belongings, chatting about the inconvenience and wondering how long they'd be delayed. None of them suspected that their routine flight had just become the opening move in an operation that would either remain forever classified or become tomorrow's international incident. As the wheels touched the tarmac, Ghost caught sight of something that made her breath catch. Parked in a remote corner of the airfield, partially concealed by maintenance hangars, was an aircraft she'd hoped never to see again. The angular, predatory silhouette was unmistakable even in the darkness. "Son of a bitch," she whispered. Tors followed her gaze and felt his pulse quicken. "Is that what I think it is?" "That," Ghost said, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and dread, "is the aircraft that got me this scar. And if it's here, it means someone thinks tonight's mission is worth risking the most classified piece of military hardware in the American arsenal. The Boeing 777 taxied toward the terminal, but Ghost was no longer thinking about civilian aircraft or commercial flights. She was thinking about Mach 3 and the thin line between atmosphere and space, about weapon systems that could rewrite the tactical situation from altitude measured in the tens of thousands of feet, and about the last time she'd flown that particular aircraft and barely survived to tell no one about it. "Your teammates better be worth it, Captain," she said, "because what you're asking me to do might just start the kind of war that ends civilizations." The aircraft came to a stop, and almost immediately, Ghost could see ground personnel approaching that definitely weren't standard airport operations. These were people who moved with the controlled precision of military specialists, and their equipment wasn't designed for routine aircraft maintenance. The Ghost was about to return to the only element where she'd ever truly belonged, the razor's edge between possible and impossible, where physics became optional and legends were born in fire and supersonic thunder. The seatbelt sign chimed off, but Ghost remained seated, staring out at the aircraft that waited for her in the darkness. She'd earned her call sign not because she was hard to see, but because everyone who'd ever faced her in combat ended up as ghosts themselves. Tonight, that legacy was about to be tested again. Captain Torres was already standing, his gear bag slung over his shoulder. "Major, we've got a very narrow window. My team doesn't have time for second thoughts." Ghost looked up at him, and for a moment, Torres saw past the legend to the woman underneath, someone who carried the weight of every mission, every life saved and lost, every impossible decision made at altitudes where the sky faded to black and the horizon curved away into infinity. "I never have second thoughts, Captain," she said, standing and moving toward the aisle with the fluid grace of someone comfortable with violence and speed in equal measure. "I only have first thoughts and consequences." As they moved toward the aircraft exit, other passengers were complaining about the delay, checking phones, and making calls to rearrange their plans. They had no idea that the woman walking past them in worn jeans and a gray sweater was about to attempt something that would either redefine what was possible in modern aerial warfare or serve as a cautionary tale about the price of pushing technology beyond its designed limitations. The jetway connected with a hollow thump, and Ghost paused at the aircraft door. Behind her was the life she'd built after deciding that some missions weren't worth the cost. Ahead was the world that had shaped her into something more dangerous than most people's nightmares and less stable than most people's prayers. "Last chance to walk away," Torres said quietly. Ghost touched the scar on her face, a memento from the last time someone had convinced her to fly an aircraft that wasn't supposed to exist on a mission that couldn't officially happen. The memory of that flight still woke her up some nights, heart pounding and skin slick with sweat, dreaming of fire, and the sound of metal screaming under stresses it was never designed to endure. "Captain," she said, stepping onto the jetway, "I stopped walking away from impossible missions the day I realized that impossible was just another word for Tuesday in my line of work." As they entered the terminal, Ghost could see through the windows that the mysterious aircraft in the distant hangar was already being prepped for flight. Ground crews were swarming around it like ants around something sweet and dangerous, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with the kind of heat that came from engines designed to push the boundaries of what Earth's atmosphere could contain. The Ghost was going home, and somewhere in a compound outside Kandahar, a team of Navy SEALs was about to learn that help was coming from a direction they'd never expected, at speeds they'd never imagined, with firepower that would redefine their understanding of what it meant to have friends in high places. The hunt was about to begin. RAF Fairford at night looked like what it was, a military installation pretending to be asleep. Security lighting created pools of harsh white illumination connected by shadows deep enough to hide entire squadrons, and the control tower's windows glowed with the soft green light of radar displays that never stopped watching the sky. Ghost walked beside Captain Torres through corridors that smelled of jet fuel and institutional coffee, past offices where people worked on projects that didn't officially exist, and planned missions that would never appear in any history book. "This way," Torres said, leading her down a stairwell that descended much farther underground than any civilian airport would require. Their footsteps echoed off concrete walls, painted the kind of institutional beige that government facilities use to discourage questions and encourage compliance. 3 levels down, they passed through a security checkpoint operated by personnel who looked like they'd been recruited from nightmares and trained by people who specialized in making problems disappear permanently. The guards examined Torres' credentials with the methodical thoroughness of people who knew that the wrong person in the wrong place could trigger the kind of international incident that started with classified briefings and ended with mushroom clouds. "Major Nakamura," the senior guard said, not looking up from his computer terminal, "you're expected in briefing room 7. Equipment has already been prepped and sized according to your service record." Ghost raised an eyebrow. "My service record is classified above your clearance level." "Not anymore, it isn't." The guard's smile was the sort that suggested he knew exactly how dangerous the woman standing in front of him was and found it amusing rather than concerning. "Tonight, your service record is whatever Colonel Morrison says it is." The mention of Morrison's name made Ghost's jaw tighten imperceptibly. Colonel Sarah Morrison was the kind of intelligence officer who collected favors like other people collected stamps, and her appearance in any operation meant that the situation was either more complex than it appeared or more dangerous than anyone was willing to admit. "Morrison's running this?" Ghost asked. "Morrison's been running this since before you got on that airplane in Frankfurt," Torres replied. "The question is whether she's running it to save my team or to put you back in a cockpit for reasons that have nothing to do with my team." They continued down the corridor past rooms labeled with code names that sounded like something from a fever dream induced by too much classified material and not enough sleep. Finally, Torres stopped at a door marked simply 7 and pressed his palm to a biometric scanner that beeped once before the lock clicked open. The briefing room beyond looked like every classified briefing room Ghost had ever been in, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sick, a conference table scarred by too many coffee cups and tactical discussions, and wall-mounted displays that could show everything from satellite imagery to aircraft schematics at the touch of a button. Colonel Morrison was already there, of course. She stood with her back to the door, studying a tactical display that showed the compound where Torres' team was pinned down. She was a small woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and the kind of posture that suggested she'd spent too many years carrying secrets heavy enough to compress vertebrae. "Ghost," she said without turning around, "it's been 3 years since Mosul?" 4 years, 2 months, and 16 days, Ghost replied. "But who's counting?" Morrison finally turned, and Ghost could see that the years hadn't been kind to the intelligence officer. There were new lines around her eyes, and her smile carried the weight of operations that had gone sideways in ways that still required therapy and medication to process. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Morrison said. "I'm not sure I have," Ghost replied. "Torres asked for combat pilots. He didn't ask for pilots willing to fly aircraft that shouldn't exist on missions that can't be acknowledged." Morrison gestured toward the tactical display. "Captain Torres' team has been conducting surveillance on a compound that we believe houses a high-value target involved in planning attacks against civilian targets in Western Europe. The mission was supposed to be simple reconnaissance, but the situation deteriorated when local forces received intelligence about their presence." Ghost studied the display, noting the deployment patterns and escape routes with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years turning tactical situations from impossible to merely improbable. How many hostiles? Estimated 40 to 60 combatants, with reinforcements en route, Morrison replied. Anti-aircraft weapons, including shoulder-fired missiles and at least 2 vehicle-mounted systems. Weather deteriorating. Storm front moving through the area, with cloud ceiling dropping and visibility down to less than a quarter mile in some areas. Ghost nodded slowly. The tactical picture was becoming clear, and it wasn't encouraging. A ground extraction would require resources that weren't available in the timeframe they had. Air support from conventional aircraft would be suicide in current weather conditions and against the kind of air defense systems the enemy had deployed. "So you want me to fly the Aurora?" Ghost said. Morrison's expression didn't change, but Torres looked confused. "The what?" "The Aurora is what people call it when they don't have the security clearance to know its real designation," Ghost explained. "It's an aircraft that officially doesn't exist, developed by people whose names are classified, using technology that violates several laws of physics and at least 3 international treaties." She turned back to Morrison. "The last time I flew that aircraft, I barely made it back alive, and the mission parameters were considerably less challenging than what you're describing tonight." "The last time you flew that aircraft," Morrison replied, "you saved the lives of 37 civilians and prevented what intelligence analysts estimated would have been a terrorist attack with casualties in the thousands." "The last time I flew that aircraft, I also discovered that whoever designed it prioritized performance over pilot survival by a ratio that still keeps me awake at night." Morrison walked to a wall-mounted safe and entered a combination that required both a numeric code and a biometric scan. The safe opened with a soft hiss, and she withdrew a flight suit that looked like it had been designed by people who understood both aerodynamics and the human anatomy's limitations under extreme gravitational stress. "Your size hasn't changed," Morrison said, handing the flight suit to Ghost. "And the aircraft has been upgraded since Mosul. Better avionics, improved pilot protection systems, and weapons packages that should make tonight's mission considerably less suicidal than your last flight." Ghost took the flight suit, feeling the familiar weight of aramid fibers and integrated electronics that would keep her alive at altitudes and speeds where unprotected human tissue would cease to function in ways that medical science preferred not to discuss in detail. "What's the mission profile?" she asked. Morrison activated the tactical display, and the compound where Tor's team was trapped appeared in 3-dimensional detail. "Low-level approach from the northwest, using the storm front for concealment. Neutralize anti-aircraft positions, provide close air support for team extraction, then egress through this corridor before local air defense systems can coordinate a response. Time to target: 43 minutes from wheels up." Ghost studied the display, running calculations in her head that involved fuel consumption rates, weapons load specifications, and the kind of physics that required advanced degrees and security clearances to fully understand. The mission was possible, but only if everything went exactly according to plan and several variables that couldn't be controlled decided to cooperate. "I'll need full tactical briefing on enemy positions, weather updates every 10 minutes, and extraction coordinates for Tor's team," she said. "Already prepared," Morrison replied, handing her a tablet containing more classified information than most military officers saw in their entire careers. Ghost looked at the device, then at Tor's, then back at Morrison. "Colonel, I need to know, is this mission about saving Captain Tor's team, or is this mission about field testing aircraft modifications that haven't been properly evaluated?" Morrison's expression hardened. "Major, that aircraft is going to be flown tonight regardless of whether you're in the cockpit. The question is whether it's flown by someone with your experience and capabilities, or by someone who's never attempted a combat mission in weather conditions that would ground conventional aircraft. In other words, You need me because everyone else is smart enough to say no. I need you because everyone else would get Captain Tor's team killed and probably start an international incident when they crashed a classified aircraft in hostile territory. Ghost looked at Tors, who had remained silent during the exchange between the two officers. Captain, your honest assessment, are your people worth the risk? Tors met her gaze without flinching. Major, my people are worth any risk, but more than that, the intelligence they've gathered could prevent attacks that would kill hundreds of civilians. If they die in that compound, the information dies with them. Ghost nodded slowly. It was the answer she'd expected, and the answer she'd needed to hear. Military operations always came down to mathematics. Lives saved versus lives risked, mission success versus acceptable casualties, strategic objectives versus tactical realities. All right, she said, beginning to unzip the flight suit, but I have conditions. Name them, Morrison said. First, I want real-time weather updates and satellite reconnaissance throughout the mission. Second, I want backup extraction protocols in case the primary mission fails. Third, if this aircraft has been modified since Mosul, I want to know exactly what's been changed and how it affects performance parameters. Done, and you'll get a full technical briefing during pre-flight. Ghost pulled on the flight suit, feeling the familiar sensation of technology designed to keep human beings alive in environments where human beings had no business being. The suit's systems began to activate automatically, running diagnostic checks and calibrating to her biometric readings. How long since you've flown? Morrison asked. 4 years, 2 months, and 16 days, Ghost replied. But some things you don't forget. Like riding a bicycle, except the bicycle goes Mach 3 and carries enough ordnance to level city blocks. Tors watched her transform from a tired-looking woman in civilian clothes to something that looked like it belonged in a science fiction film about humanity's next evolutionary step. The flight suit wasn't just clothing. It was a life support system designed to function as an interface between human consciousness and aircraft that pushed the boundaries of what physics would tolerate. How do you feel about flying again? Tors asked. Ghost sealed the final connector on her suit and looked at him with eyes that had seen too much sky and too much war. Captain, I feel the same way I always feel before a mission that shouldn't be possible with aircraft that shouldn't exist. I feel like I'm about to find out whether I'm as good as I think I am, or whether tonight's the night I discover that confidence and capability aren't the same thing. She picked up the helmet that Morrison had provided and examined the heads-up display systems that would project tactical information directly onto her visor. Besides, your boys are counting on me, and I've never left anyone behind who was counting on me. Never, Morrison asked. Ghost's expression darkened slightly, never successfully. The briefing room fell silent except for the steady hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of aircraft operations. Outside, the storm that would provide concealment for Ghost's approach was building strength, and somewhere in a compound outside Kandahar, a team of Navy SEALs was measuring their remaining ammunition and wondering if help would arrive before the enemy decided to stop playing games and bring in the heavy weapons. Time was running out, and the Ghost was about to return to the element where she'd earned her legendary status, the thin air between Earth and space, where only the fastest, smartest, and most ruthlessly competent survived long enough to become legends. The hunt was about to begin in earnest. The walk to the hangar felt longer than it should have, even though Ghost knew they were covering the distance at a brisk military pace. Every step took her closer to an aircraft she'd hoped never to see again, and every step brought back memories of the last mission. The screaming of overstressed metal, the sensation of pulling G-forces that pushed human physiology beyond its design specifications, and the moment when she'd realized that surviving the flight would require skills that weren't taught in any flight school and luck that wasn't distributed by any known statistical model. The hangar doors were already open when they arrived, revealing a space large enough to service aircraft considerably larger than anything the public knew existed. Work lights illuminated the interior with harsh white intensity, and Ghost could see technicians making final preparations on something that looked like it had been designed by people who'd studied both aerospace engineering and predatory biology in equal measure. Jesus, Torres whispered. The Aurora, or rather, the aircraft that people called Aurora when they didn't have the security clearance to know its actual designation, sat in the center of the hangar like a piece of controlled lightning that had decided to take physical form. Its angular surfaces seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the air around the engines shimmered with the kind of heat distortion that suggested power systems operating at energy levels that civilian technology couldn't approach. "She's beautiful," Ghost said, and there was something in her voice that made Torres understand that for pilots like her, aircraft weren't just machines. They were partners in a dance performed at altitudes and speeds where the margin for error was measured in milliseconds and meters. Colonel Morrison approached, carrying a tablet displaying pre-flight checklists that were considerably more complex than anything used by commercial aviation. Final systems checks are complete. Weather reconnaissance shows the storm front is intensifying, which should provide excellent concealment, but will also make flying conditions extremely challenging. Define extremely challenging, Ghost said, walking around the aircraft and conducting her own visual inspection. Turbulence severe enough to damage conventional aircraft. Wind shear that would tear apart anything not specifically designed for extreme weather penetration. And visibility conditions that would make instrument flight mandatory even for pilots with perfect vision. Ghost nodded, running her hands along the aircraft's surface and feeling the subtle vibrations that indicated systems operating far beyond normal parameters. What about the weapons package? Air-to-ground missiles specifically designed for precision strikes against hardened targets. Electronic warfare systems capable of disrupting enemy communications and radar, and a cannon system that fires projectiles at velocities that create kinetic effects similar to small explosives. How many shots? Enough to neutralize the anti-aircraft positions and provide sustained close air support for team extraction. Ghost completed her external inspection and approached the aircraft's cockpit, which opened with a soft hydraulic hiss. The interior looked like something from a spacecraft rather than a conventional fighter. Displays and controls that seemed to anticipate the pilot's needs. Seats designed to protect human physiology during maneuvers that would liquefy unprotected tissue. And life support systems capable of functioning in environments ranging from sea level to the edge of space. "How long do I have?" she asked. Morrison checked her watch. 37 minutes to target. Captain Torres' team reports enemy activity is increasing, and they estimate they have less than 2 hours before their position becomes completely untenable. Ghost climbed into the cockpit and began running through pre-flight procedures that seemed to involve more technology than most people encountered in their entire lives. Systems activated with soft beeps and status lights that painted her face in shades of amber and green, and the aircraft's computers began interfacing with her flight suit to monitor everything from heart rate to neural activity. "Ghost," Morrison said, "I need you to understand something. This mission has implications beyond saving Captain Torres' team. The intelligence they've gathered could prevent terrorist attacks that would kill thousands of civilians. But more than that, there are people who want this aircraft's capabilities publicly demonstrated, and there are people who want those capabilities to remain secret." "Which people are you?" Ghost asked, continuing her pre-flight checklist. "I'm the people who want Captain Torres' team brought home alive, and the intelligence they've gathered delivered to analysts who can use it to save lives." Ghost looked up from her instruments, and the other people will have to settle for disappointment. The aircraft's engines began to spool up, creating a sound unlike anything Torres had ever heard. A deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to make the air itself vibrate with contained power. The hangar's fluorescent lights flickered as electrical systems drew power from sources that weren't listed in any public energy production database. "Captain Torres," Ghost called over the engine noise. "I need extraction coordinates for your team and confirmation that they can provide target designation for anti-aircraft positions." Torres activated his secure communication device and began transmitting coordinates and tactical updates to his pinned-down team. Ghost could hear fragments of radio traffic through her helmet communications, terse, professional exchanges that carried the unmistakable tension of people under fire and running low on options. "Ghost, this is Reaper 6, came a voice crackling with static and stress. "We've got your coordinates and we're ready to mark targets, but be advised, enemy activity is increasing and we're taking sporadic fire from multiple directions." "Reaper 6, this is Ghost," she replied, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who'd done this too many times to be rattled by adverse conditions. "I'm wheels up in 10 minutes. Mark your targets with infrared strobes and be ready for immediate extraction once I've cleared the anti-aircraft positions." "Copy, Ghost, and thanks for coming to the party." Ghost smiled grimly. "Reaper 6, I never turned down an invitation to dance." The final pre-flight checks completed successfully, and Ghost felt the familiar sensation of man and machine becoming something greater than the sum of their parts. The aircraft's computer systems were now monitoring her vital signs and neural activity, ready to assist or intervene if combat stress pushed her beyond safe operational parameters. "Tower, this is Ghost requesting clearance for immediate departure," she transmitted to the control tower. "Ghost, you are cleared for departure. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly, and you'll be flying through the worst storm system recorded in the North Atlantic this year." "Copy, Tower, I've flown through worse." "Ghost, no one has flown through worse." She laughed, a sound that carried equal parts confidence and recklessness. "Tower, you obviously haven't read my service record." The hangar doors began to open wider, revealing a night sky torn by lightning and lashed by winds that would ground any sensible aircraft. But Ghost wasn't flying any sensible aircraft, and she wasn't a sensible pilot. She was a ghost hunting through storms that would kill anyone foolish enough to challenge them with insufficient preparation and inadequate equipment. The Aurora rolled forward, its engines creating thrust vectors that seemed to defy conventional understanding of how aircraft generated forward motion. As they cleared the hangar, Ghost could feel the storm's fury buffeting the aircraft, winds that would tear apart conventional fighters and turbulence that would disable